Hey everyone, I am Anika and welcome to my channel. Today we're picking back up the Beginner Power Tools series and we are talking about a circular saw. A circular saw is a great beginner power saw. It is very versatile, it can make accurate cuts, and it is compact, portable, and easy to store, making it a great choice for small workshops or apartments. But because it's such a versatile tool, every workshop needs one. Let's get into all the details you need to know to use a circular saw. First of all, what's a circular saw? So a circular saw basically has a motor right here and a blade that spins, and then you push the saw through the lumber, which is the main difference between a circular saw and a table saw. On a table saw, you have the blade spinning and you push the material through the blade. Now you can use a circular saw to make all kinds of cuts. You can make a cross cut, a bevel cut, a miter cut, and even a rip cut. You can cut various materials with it, and we will get into all those details in just a little bit. Now the size of the circular saw is defined by the size of the blade. This is a 7¼ inch circular saw, which is probably the most common size of circular saws. This one here is a 5-inch circular saw, and this is a compact circular saw. It usually has a blade that is smaller than 5 inches. This one is 4½ inches. This is great for getting into tight spaces or making quick cuts. But the most commonly used circular saw has a 7¼ inch size blade. Now, what difference does that make? The size of the blade defines how deep you can cut. A 7¼ inch saw can cut up to 2½ inches deep. Another difference between circular saws in the market is the side of the blade. This is a right-handed blade, and this is the left-hand side blade. Now, which one works for you really comes down to your personal preference. I think both of them have their own pros and cons. I am right-handed, so when I use this saw with the right-handed blade, I like the way I'm able to grip the saw and use it. However, my hand can sometimes block my line of sight to where I'm making the cut. On the other hand, the left-handed blade, I can see the cut line right there really easily, but the handholds are just a little bit awkward. And then there is the corded version and the battery-powered version. And there's always a debate between if a corded version or a battery-powered version is better. In my experience, I think they both perform the same, except as long as the battery has the charge. As the battery starts to be lower in charge, you will see a fall in performance of the saw. And that's with any battery operated tool really. But the freedom of not having cords is definitely a big advantage. Now let's talk about all the parts of a circular saw. So let's start with the blade. The blade spins in the counterclockwise direction and makes the cut from the bottom up. There are different types of blades available depending on the type of material you're cutting. You can even cut metal with blades that are specifically meant for that. The number of teeth is another important factor, and that defines the finish of the cut. In general, the higher the number of teeth, the smoother the finish. I typically use a 40-tooth blade to make most of my cuts. But I also have a 24-tooth blade on this saw, which I usually use to quickly cut down boards. Outside here is the blade cover, which encloses the blade and is actually made of two parts. The top part, which is the permanent part, which protects the blade, but it also keeps all the sawdust from flying back towards you as you make the cut. The bottom retractable cover is also extremely important for safety. It moves up as you make the cut, exposing the blade as needed, and is spring-loaded to retract when the cut is complete, and it covers the blade as it comes to a stop while you put it down. The lever controls the retractable blade, and sometimes when you start a cut, especially on thin material, you might have to help push it up just a little bit to get the cut going. But once you have the cut going, you can let go and make your cut, and the blade cover will automatically retract as you go through the cut. Now let's talk about the handles. The handle and the handhold are both useful to guide the saw while in use. The handle is used by the dominant hand to push the saw, while the other hand holds the handhold, guiding the saw through the cut. And most importantly, keeping your hands away from the blade while you're making the cut. Now let's talk about the two types of adjustments that you have on the saw. First is the depth adjustment, which allows you to set the depth of the saw blade or how deep the saw will cut. You can simply unlock the lever in the back and move the base plate up and down to change the depth. The second is the bevel adjustment, which is usually at the front of the saw, and you can change the angle from 0 degrees to 45 degrees. Now the base plate or the shoe is this metal plate surrounding the blade that allows for the saw to rest on the material while you're cutting to keep it level and steady. Now it has markings and notches that allow you to line up the cut lines. This is for the 0 degree cut and this is for the 45 degree bevel cut. The gap in the notch is for the kerf, which should be taken into account while aligning the saw to the cut line. I discussed the concept of the kerf in great detail in my miter saw video, but really it applies to any saw and needs to be taken into account to get accurate cuts. Finally, here is the on-off switch and a trigger. Some saws have the trigger and some don't. Usually, if they both exist, you have to hold down the trigger and turn on the saw for it to work, which is a safety feature. Now let's talk real quick about changing the blade. Now every brand has its own little variation of the technique of changing the blade, so be sure to take a look at your owner's manual to see exactly what your saw needs. But your saw will most probably come with a compatible wrench. This saw right here comes with a wrench attached, and you simply go ahead and use it to open up the spindle to change the blade. Whereas this saw right here actually comes with an Allen key, which is stored conveniently in here, and you lock the spindle with this button and open and change the blade. The teeth on the saw blade are always in the upward direction, so make sure you put the blade in the right way. Now let's get ready to use the saw. But before we use the saw, be sure to read your instruction manual carefully so you get to know your brand of circular saw really well, because there can be differences from brand to brand. And one last thing before we start: safety. Be sure to wear safety glasses, hearing protection, and a respirator or dust mask. And make sure you have no loose clothing, jewelry, or long hair in the way. So once you have marked the cut line, you want to set up the board. And the setup depends on the type of material you are cutting. If you are cutting a sheet of plywood, you want to support both sides of the cut as close to the cut line as possible. Many people use a sheet of foam insulation, but I don't have space in my workshop to store it. So instead, I use 4x4 boards to prop up the plywood while I make the cut. The key here is really to support the pieces of plywood as close to the cut line as possible. Because if you don't support them, as you make the cut, the boards will start to collapse in on each other. And that will pinch the saw blade and cause the saw to bind, leading to a kickback. In fact, on this other side, you will notice that it is completely supported by the 4x4 across the cut line. As I make the cut, it is going to go into the 4x4 just a little bit, but that's totally fine. If you are cutting dimensional lumber like 1x2, 1x3, 2x4s, you can simply clamp it to a work surface. Now to make the cut, I like to use a straight edge to guide the saw along it. Now you could make the cut without the straight edge guide and use your eyes to guide the saw, but that can lead to inaccurate cuts. And if you are not in a completely straight line, it can lead to the saw blade pinching and binding, and that can lead to a lot of frustrations. Now you can use any straight edge clamped down as a guide, like a level or a yardstick or the factory edge of a plywood, as long as you know that it is a straight edge. There are also many jigs available in the market, or you can make a homemade jig to help guide the saw. Here I am using the edge of the plywood to guide the saw. You can also measure the width of the plate from the blade and clamp the straight edge accordingly. Of course, as you are clamping it, you want to make sure that it is perfectly perpendicular to the edges with a speed square. The clamps should be nice and tight to make sure that the straight edge does not move. If it moves during the cut, the blade will start to bind and it will lead to a lot of frustration. Now, before beginning the cut, you want to set the blade depth. The teeth of the blade should be at about 1/8 inch below the material or less than half a tooth below the material. Once that is locked in, you can set the base plate on the surface. Align the notch on the front to the cut mark. Turn on the saw and let it come to a full speed. Once it is full speed, you can feed the blade into the material. Once the cut is complete, the blade guard will automatically close and you can set the saw down while you wait for it to come to a complete stop. Here's an example of when I used my circular saw set at 45 degrees to make a bevel cut on my boards. One of my favorite ways to make cuts on plywood that are smaller than 2 feet is using the rip cut, where you clamp the saw into the rip cut and it slides along the outer edge supporting the saw. On dimensional boards, to make cross cuts, you can simply use a speed square to help guide the circular saw to make the cut. Circular saws are fairly straightforward to use, and once you get a hang of it, you can make many projects and even many different types of cuts with them. You can make a plunge cut or even a half lap cut. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below or let me know what other tools you would like me to talk about. And as always, I truly appreciate you watching and your thumbs up. And if you aren't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button because I have lots of tool tutorials and fun projects coming your way very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye.